Well, greetings, friends. I am pleased to be here with you this evening. It's interesting times, always a good time for a talk on Degas. Sometimes what you need in the busy world in which we live is a little time to reflect on the past. And that's what we have here for us today. So I appreciate you all taking time out from your busy schedules to join us this evening, and taking time out from the television news and refreshing the news programs on your phone, all of that. I understand there's something of current interest happening in the country. Apparently there was an election a couple of days ago that's still going on. So I really do appreciate you all being out here this evening to join us for the second in our series of 3 talks sponsored by Diane Jacobson and the Cummer Beaches in association with the Cummer Museum and the Beaches Museum and my home institution, UNF. I am Dr. Scott Brown, and I am so pleased to be here with you this evening to share a story of Degas, the great Impressionist master of the 19th century, and his dancers, his interest in ballet. I want to say at the beginning of my talk that we'll be taking questions at the end. Please use the chat function in our Zoom software at any point during the talk to jot down a question if you have one, and then we'll answer those at the end of the talk. I want to again thank all of our partners and Diane Jacobson for making tonight possible. And I want to especially thank the Cummer Museum at this moment in time. Of course, we have a new director who's recently been announced, and it's a good night to feature a little known gem in our museum that is another proof of how many wonderful things we have here in our community. The Degas drawing, which I'm going to be talking about tonight, is a little mystery. I love mysteries. I especially love mysteries when I find them in my own backyard. When I first saw Degas' drawing in the Cummer collection, which has been there since 2005, I was struck by its strangeness. It is, in one respect, exactly what we expect of Degas. If you know anything about Edgar Degas, the 19th century French artist who specialized in making pictures of ballet dancers in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and you know he loved dance. He was absolutely passionate about ballet. It's the one thing that the public really knows about him. So it's not at all surprising to find ballet dancers at the center of the image. I was struck, however, by the presence in the background of what is unmistakably, in the upper right-hand corner, upper left-hand corner, the Acropolis of ancient Greece, with the ruins of the Parthenon standing on top of the mountain. Now, this is a detail that has been addressed by the Cummer in its interpretation of the work. And the suggestion, the obvious suggestion has been made that this is a scene backdrop for a ballet set in ancient Greece. That would hardly be surprising. There's nothing more classical than classical ballet in the 19th century. And a lot of ballets were set in ancient Greece. The problem with this, and what makes this picture so mysterious at first, is that Degas did not do settings. He did dancers all day long. He drew and sketched and painted dancers. He even sculpted them. But he did not care a whit for setting. Now, as I say, there's nothing more classical than ballet, but Degas was not interested in classical ballet either. In fact, another thing that Degas really never depicted was dancing itself. And we see here a ballet manual, a classic in the field from the early 19th century, the 1830s, with an illustration of poses and positions in ballet. And we're struck initially by a couple of things in this illustration. One, the association of the dancer with ancient Greek costume and appearance. Ballet and classical antiquity went hand in hand in the 19th century. In fact, 19th century thinkers about ballet and dance trace the roots of the style and the form to notions of ancient Greek art, to the classical art of ancient Greece. And that's made clear for us in the costume of these figures in the illustration. But Degas was not interested in this image of classical perfection. In fact, his dancers are very distinctive. They are always of the same type. They're rather awkward looking and not terribly attractive. In fact, quite honestly plain in many cases. Critics at the time and since have remarked their snub noses and their skinny ankles. They have been described as street urchins, which in fact they were really. Most ballet dancers of the era were tough little kids taken from the streets, the daughters of laundresses and milliners who looked to ballet as a difficult, rigorous, but still appealing way off of the streets in many cases. His ballet dancers, moreover, are represented not in dance, but in rest quite frequently. This is a study of a dancer in the fourth position, but not a formal fourth position. It's what's called relaxed fourth position. It's a relaxed stance in which the ballet dancers would stand in the studio while waiting for their turn to dance. And that's characteristic of the way that Degas depicts his dancers in candid poses. In fact, he would frequent the ballet studios, and that's what he drew, that's what he represented. Not the performances, not the way that we're supposed to see it from the stage, but rather inside views. So here we see a ballet girl in repose, and she looks a little bit like a bird on the ground. That is, a creature capable of grace, but not in its current context here. The awkward slouching posture of a figure who is not actively concerned about appearing graceful or elegant. And those candid views were the ones that Degas was after. Both in the studio and in the rehearsal hall, we see here a characteristic example of what I mean. The image here of the necks of the basso fiddles breaks our view of the scene. And we see girls standing in the wings, waiting their turn to dance, and here hanging onto the scenery in the background. The scenery, meanwhile, is amorphous. It's very characteristic of the Impressionist style in which Degas painted. That is, we don't see anything recognizable. There's a vague vegetation, and in the background, a scaffolding which reveals the absence of a scene. Degas was not interested in the illusion of perfection that was offered by the performance of ballet. He was interested in the reality of the awkwardness of waiting in the wings, the slouching figures here of the producers and the men on the stage who are watching, and the various postures of the girls. In the center, only one of them dances. All of the others are there as a study in contrast. We see that really beautifully in this wonderful piece where here the girl on point dances, but next to her, another ballerina bends over with her broad white tutued rear exposed to the viewer as she relaces her slipper. Or here again, as the one figure dances in a rehearsal, while in the wings, men and ballerinas stand beside stage partitions, waiting their turn to come on or watching from the wings. All of the views that Degas gives us are views that would be impossible from the space of the theater in ballet. We see strange top-down perspectives or sideways views from the wings. And that's characteristic of how Degas studied the ballerinas. Here we go to the studios and, as they often remarked, stand at the top of the steps, looking down into the rehearsal space. Aside from being a bit creepy, that was a good way for Degas to get candid and strange views of people without them watching him as he watched them. In the later part of his career, Degas begins to crop his scenes very severely, so that we see here not dancing at all, but again, figures in the wings hanging on to the stage partition, waiting for their turn to go on, and adjusting the straps of their shoulders. These figures are not without a kind of grace, but it's not the grace of a dancer in performance. It's not the grace of controlled technique. They are quite realistic, candid, scratching their backs, clustering around and waiting. This is far from the ideal image of classical perfection. And that brings us to the question of Degas' relationship to the classical past. Degas began his career as a classically trained artist, in fact, quite conservative. He, as we can see here, is channeling that past in his representation of the Acropolis with the Parthenon on top. There's nothing more emblematic of antiquity and of classical style than the Parthenon, than the great temple of Athena in Athens, with the sculptures of Phidias and the most famous Elgin marbles, the most famous sculptures of ancient Greece, sculptures that really defined for the 19th century the notion of classical ideal. The Parthenon is characterized in a classic Greek fashion in the same way ballet is characterized by a rigid symmetry of X and Y axes, of horizontals and verticals. It's all about graceful, harmonious form in space. Classical style is regular, it is controlled, and it presents privileged views to the viewer. That's nowhere more true than in the Parthenon, which stands atop the Acropolis and can be approached by the Panathenaic road that leads from the town up to the city, so that the architects plan for the views of approach, the vistas that it offers from a distance. Degas was very interested, as all 19th century artists were, in the classical past. And he looked to classical art as the source of his own style early in his career. He was an avid copyist, and we see here Degas making a painting after another very, very famous painter, Nicolas Poussin, from 2 centuries earlier. And Poussin is known as one of the great channelers of classical style in the modern era. Here, Degas' own original work from the 1860s depicts a classical subject, Semiramis, building Babylon. And the whole painting has the structure of art from the Parthenon. The frieze-like painting, which is long and horizontal, is characterized by a strong profile view of the figures inside of it, much like the profile views offered by the procession frieze from the Panathenaic procession of the Parthenon. We see here the chariot wheels and the horse and the peplos-wearing maidens standing in front of the chariot. It's all very much channeling the spirit of classical Greece. This is not the Degas we know, but it is the Degas that we had for 20 years or so, from the beginning of his career to about the 1870s. Degas was deeply interested in classical style, and he was classically trained. He had a classic academic training, which he really had to work to move past as he joined the Impressionists and other artists of the modern era who were critiquing the conservative classical methods of the generations past. And we see him here in these early studies from the 1850s, copying or imitating Greek models, the Borghese gladiator or the famous Apoxyomenos sculpture here on the right. He did studies of classical antiquities. Here's a vase in the form of a head. And he owned quite a number of works from earlier artists that were themselves classicizing. He looked to Delacroix and to Ingres and also to David, great artists of the earlier Romantic and Neoclassical eras, for a relationship to antique art. This is true of one of the most interesting of Degas' works from this era, a painting that he began in 1860. And this is an oil sketch of that work, known as the Young Spartans. And it depicts young Spartan girls on the left, teasing or mocking a group of young Spartan boys on the right. A very unusual story, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment. But this too, this is a work that very clearly channels the classical ideal as Degas understood it. He looks to Jacques-Louis David's famous Oath of the Horatii from 1784, and a composition that's highly similar, this female figure extending her arm, very much like the Horatio brothers taking their oath to their father. Well, Degas became, at a certain point in time, disenchanted with this idea. In fact, he wrote extensively in his own diaries and spoke to his friends about why he began to reject this vision of the classical style. The most famous artists of the era were artists who were unashamedly classical in their motivations. The great Jean-Léon Gérôme, for instance. But Degas was not satisfied imitating the antique. He abandoned it, finally, he said, because it was impossible to make a truly classical work. That was lost, it was gone. That era could only be imitated in a pale and derivative way. And he, like other artists, Monet, Manet, began to seek beyond the classical for new ways of looking, new ways of thinking about style and art. In many ways, though, that shift begins with this famous painting from his early era, The Young Spartans, which is probably Degas' most important work from the era before 1870. The story is an unusual story in itself, not the typical kind of subject that we find in classically themed artworks. It depicts these young girls here who are attending gymnasium. They are going to school alongside the boys, which was unusual, but happened in Sparta. Usually the girls were not allowed to go to school. And in this case, the girls are teasing the boys. I mean, it's a story as old as time itself, right? The girls tease the boys tease the girls. They chase each other. And that's exactly what is happening here. The Spartans had a tradition, sort of a graduation tradition, where the girls would mock the boys in order to challenge them to grow up, to be better men. And they would challenge them, in fact, to race. And the winners of the race, essentially, were crowned the champions of the school. And this is a very real, very serious challenge. You can see here the aggressive posture of the women on the left, reaching out and lunging, and the expressions on their faces. The boys, by contrast, are rather retiring and a little awkward looking. And in fact, the entire energy of this scene is awkward, much like Degas' ballet dancers. He is exploring here a subject which has plenty of potential for awkwardness. The awkwardness of youth, both the physical and the sexual and the psychological awkwardness of youth, which are here translated into a picture of lunging and shrinking figures. And it is a work in which he was, in many ways, tackling the whole classical ideal in itself. Because even though this is a classical subject, the manner in which it's treated, the idea in which he thinks of the physical form is far from ideal. It's far from idealizing. There's a realism, both social and visual, in this work, which marks a new turning point for Degas. He began this work in 1860, but he returned to it in the 1870s and reworked it continuously until 1880, when he exhibited it for the very first time. It's thus a work that leads us from Degas' classical beginnings to a new era, an era in which our picture from the Cummer Museum is extremely important. This is the only image, virtually the only image that Degas ever produced in which he combines his ballet dancers with an explicitly classical reference to the ideas that interested him early in his career. It's the only image, virtually the only image, we'll see one other later on in our talk, in which Degas combines these two ideas. The mystery is, what's going on with this classical reference in the background? It is not, I'm convinced, a scene or a setting or a backdrop, because Degas simply didn't include those. It is, on the other hand, a classical presence that imposes, as the Acropolis does, as the Parthenon does, from on high, towering above in the background over the awkward young women who are themselves not dancing, but posing. These are young ballerinas, far from the prima ballerinas or the stars of the show. They are undoubtedly the kinds of girls that Degas sketched most frequently. The young students aspiring to the corps de ballet. They were all of a type, these young girls. They were rather poor, from poor and depressed areas of Paris. They had difficult lives, and they were astonishingly strong young women. They went through a rigorous process in which most of the candidates for the corps de ballet were weeded out to arrive at this point then even to be a student was a great triumph. But they were there primarily because they were strong, not because they were talented. And even then, many of them failed to make it into the final corps de ballet. So we have the classical ideal in the background and a realist image in the foreground of these awkward posing young girls, not the swans of the performance on stage, but rather those ugly ducklings in the back rooms, practicing and hoping for a shot at the big time, as we see in images like this. Well, Degas began the 1870s working still in this classical mode. And in around 1872 or 73, he began to paint and to depict these ballet dancers. His method of working at the time was characterized by an academic training. We see here in this preparatory sketch, produced sometime during the 20 years between 1860 and 1880, a sketch for the young Spartans. And it's this awkwardly posed figure who's stretching or doing some sort of physical exercise on the ground, a young boy over on the far right-hand side. It's a rather awkward picture, but Degas begins in a very classical manner, very traditional manner, creating the grid, the XY axis in which he inscribes the figure and develops it in a careful drawing that uses all of the technique that he had at his disposal. It's precisely, though, this technique that Degas begins to fight against in the 1870s, as he seeks a freer and more candid style, one that is, like dance itself, less controlled in the manner of classical technique and more spontaneous. We see in 1873, one of his early ballerinas, with again the same classical preparation, the sketching of the grid, the inscription of the figure within a space. But the pose now, like the figure kneeling in the last image, is itself awkward as she hunches over and adjusts her strap. None of Degas' figures, as I say, dance. They pose, they're pictured in awkward and candid postures. They are represented in training, but not, that is, in any formal process of dance. In 1874, here in 1875, a figure of a girl leaning over, but still rendered in that prepared technique in which the artist is thinking of the figure in relationship to that classical grid, the grid of space that arranges the form of the figure, even here in 1876. But we can see Degas trying more and more adventurous schemes as he adjusts the figure. The way that he draws becomes more fluid. We can see him going back over his line, that is changing the stroke as he adjusts the figure. The leg moves and there's a vestige of an arm for another figure that was never executed. He's beginning to draw in a less formal and a less precise manner as he explores the candid possibilities of his subjects, to the point in about 1878 where he begins finally to abandon that grid and to draw freely on the page without the preparation of space that structures and gives the formal elegance to the figure that defines its participation in a more classical spatial environment. We can see in 1880, and here from the mid-1880s, 1885, even more dynamic and gestural compositions in which Degas is interested now in movement and awkward contortions of the body. This is not in any sense an ideal image of a dancer. One might even say that it's not beautiful in a classic sense, but that is precisely what Degas is doing. And it's a fascinating gesture because, of course, in a classic sense, in a formal sense, we think of ballet and the dancer on the stage in costume with the music playing and the setting in the background as one of the most fantastical visions of perfect reality that can be imagined. It is a fantasy. And that's the fantasy that Degas is trying to puncture, the fantasy of classical perfection. Instead, he gives us the candid realism of these street urchins who, with their vigorous and strong and rough ways, are mastering the movements, the postures, the positions in an aspiration to join the ballet, but they are themselves not yet beautiful ballerinas. 1889, 1900, how he's drawing very freely, and the duplication of the figure in an ambiguous space, where the figures seem to emerge almost like the many-armed goddesses of Indian art out of a single body or a single torso. There is a real freedom, a gestural approach to the body and its movement that Degas lacked earlier in his career. Our work of art is very important to that whole transition, to the history of Degas' development. I'm convinced, in fact, that it is the missing link in Degas' career. The Cummer Dancers is currently given a date of 1890 in the museum collection. That date is a guess, essentially, as is often the case when we're dealing with undated sketches, ephemera from an artist's career. And it is not based, I think, on any strong evidence. In fact, just the contrary. I believe our work is a crucial work from the 1870s, as Degas is beginning to explore the subject of the ballerina and of dance in his images. It's an image that connects the classical past in Degas' early career to his new interest in the ballerina. And more importantly than that, I think it is the image in which, metaphorically, he's showing how his interest in the ballet dancer, in this rather awkward, ugly duckling of the stage, is meant to puncture the myth of the classical ideal. What Degas is exploring is what we might call a classical realism rather than a classical idealism. There is, in fact, another image, almost identical to ours. Not a sketch, but now a pastel on board in the Dallas Museum of Art. Both the Cummer picture and the Dallas picture are unpublished. To my knowledge, they've never been put side to side together in the same space before. They are, obviously, twins. Dallas gives its picture an estimated date of 1895 to 1897. This is not correct either. And again, it's a guess. Frequently, these dates are bestowed by dealers. Generally speaking, it's a date that falls right into the middle of Degas' late maturity, which is a date then that is safe from an economic standpoint. It's not aggressively early, it's not terribly late, and in that sense, it's a date that's based on no firm ground at all. The central figure of the Cummer sketch appears in another painting, however, by Degas from 1879. We know that it was finished in 1879 because it was exhibited in that year. And you can see that the central figure in our sketch is identical in reverse to the figure in Degas' painting from 1879, the dancer before a window. And in fact, this picture deals with the same questions that our sketch does. It's not the Parthenon in the background, but it is an architectural setting in which the room is defined by long vertical panes and a window. Degas has left long horizontal streaks in the floorboards apparent, and there appears to be a glimpse of that grid-like underdrawing coming through the pigment. The ballerina is inscribed in and against this spatial environment that Degas was wrestling with during this period of the 1870s. The classical grid, the classical organized ideal, and he's moving away from it. This is a painting which is an important transitional work in that discussion, and our picture is as well. In fact, the central figure in the Cummer drawing is identical, I believe, in facial appearance and in her characteristic awkwardness, to one of Degas' most famous models from this era. Marie van Goethem was a young girl studying to join the corps de ballet, and she was successful in 1880. She was 14 to 15 years old at the time that she posed for Degas in the 1870s, 1878, 79, and 80. She was, as we can see here in both of these images, had a very distinctive appearance, very distinctive facial appearance, and was Degas' favored model during this era. Our central figure is, I believe, also Marie van Goethem, and this drawing belongs to that suite of images that Degas produced in the 1878-79 period, based on Marie van Goethem, this young, awkward, adolescent girl studying for the corps de ballet at the Paris Opera. Marie van Goethem is the model for the most famous work by Edgar Degas. If you've ever seen any Degas before, you've probably seen this one. This is a sculpture. It's the first time we've talked about sculpture tonight. In fact, Degas is not known as a sculptor. And this is the very first sculpture that he's known to have produced. He made it at the end of this period of the 1870s, beginning in 1880. It was a very unusual work, based on his studies of Marie van Goethem. And our drawing, I think, is a part of the crucial process that Degas went through in the 1870s, as he began to explore the potential of the ballerina at rest, the ballerina in repose, the candid image of the dancer not dancing, the awkwardness of the body, trained for performance, but in a state of rest and laxity. And that's what we see here in this image. You can see from different angles the visage of Marie van Goethem and our Cummer dancer. Our picture is a missing link in Degas' career. It probably should be dated 1879 to 80, from that same era in which Degas was actively using Marie van Goethem as a model. It's a missing link that connects us from Degas' mature work and from his interest in sculpture and ballet dance back to his classical origins in his interest in antiquity. It's a work that connects the famous statue of Marie van Goethem, the little dancer aged 14, connects this statue in his interest in sculpture specifically to his interest in antiquity and in classical art. Degas made this sculpture in about 1880, and he exhibited it for the first time, in fact, the only time, in 1881, at a salon held by the Impressionists. It was the only sculpture that he ever exhibited. He went on to make many sculptures. In fact, Renoir, years later, would declare that Degas was the greatest living sculptor. And various critics of the time asserted that Degas was the first modern sculptor. They claimed that he, like Manet and Monet before him, had done for sculpture what they had done for painting and obliterated the conservative classical traditions of the mid-19th century, brought something new on the stage. That, however, was not initially how this statue was received. It's a bizarre work. It's sculpted from wax around bits of clay with a metal armature inside. Moreover, it is, in the spirit of the time, a completely bizarre work aesthetically. It's not idealizing at all. In fact, the critics who responded to it in 1881 declared that this was the most hideous model one could possibly imagine. Far from being idealizing, she represented a sort of a criminal depravity in which were writ all the possible vices of street urchins of Paris in an era that was remarkable for, of course, its great disparities of wealth. And the urchins in the street and the refined parlors and salons of the wealthy were worlds apart in France. Marie van Goethem was characteristic. She was the daughter of a single mother, a laundress, whose great hope was to join the corps de ballet, which she did in 1880, although she flamed out after only a year, probably brought down by her personal difficulties. She was known to frequent a bar in the 9th arrondissement of Paris, known as the Dead Rat. And that tells us something about the circumstances from which she was trying to to rescue herself, and from which she failed to rescue herself. The little dancer, aged 14, is bizarre in another respect, not only in its lack of idealization, but in its strange aesthetic adventurousness. It is a polychrome sculpture painted. In fact, the beeswax doesn't reveal this today because wax darkens over time, but Degas pigmented the wax itself using various ochre pigments of red and orange and brown. And he painted the bodice and clothed her in real clothes and gave her real hair on the back. It's a strange composite sculpture that really set everyone's teeth on edge in 1881, even as it really was ahead of its time and is regarded today as one of Degas' great masterpieces. Degas never exhibited sculpture again, but he continued to make it throughout his career. And it's not surprising in many respects that Degas was led to the making of this sculpture by his interest in ballet and by his interest in the dancer's relationship to the old classical ideal. In fact, another little known story of Degas is that the very first images of dancers that he ever made are these sketches which he produced based on an ancient classical statuette. Not one of the famous statues of the Parthenon, but a very humble little object, a terracotta dancer that was excavated in Athens in around 1850 by a French archaeologist named Auguste Titu. And this Titu, the Titu dancer, as it's known in French, the danseuse Titu, was brought back to Paris, and it caused a sensation, because it was considered to be so fresh and so new and so unlike what people expected classical art to be. It wasn't marble and it wasn't bronze. It was the humble medium of clay. And clay has completely different possibilities of shape and of texture and of detail in its rendering. It's a much more modest kind of sculpture, especially for figurative sculpture. Degas produced his very first known image of a dancer in 1857 in a sketch after this famous little statuette. Another work, Oil on Board, from the same era, depicts the statuette from the side. His introduction to the dancer, in other words, was also an introduction through classical art, but classical art of an alternative variety. In 1873, at the same time that Degas began to make images of ballerinas, the most amazing archaeological discovery transpired. French archaeologists in Greece and local Greek archaeologists uncovered a cache of tombs in the ancient city of Tanagra in the region of Boeotia, a part of Greece outside of Athens and Attica. The excavations there in Tanagra in 1872 and 1873 unearthed the largest known cache of ceramic sculptures. They were in extraordinarily good states of preservation, and the figurines were so remarkable for their vivacity, the quality of life, and their authenticity, that they immediately became synonymous with the type of clay terracotta statuette, which is found, like the Titu dancer, in many places in the ancient world. And they're now known today as Tanagra figurines. In fact, Tanagra became a kind of craze. The very first Tanagra sculptures were acquired by a French collector and brought back to Paris in 1873, where Degas and many other artists began to see them in the private rooms of the collectors and the museums. It wasn't until 1879, though, that the very first public exhibition of Tanagra figurines happened, just a year or two before Degas debuted his own first sculpture, his own first statuette. The Tanagra figurines were remarkable for a number of reasons in the 19th century. One was that they were considered to be, like Degas' dancers, candid views of real people, rather than perfect views of the ideal goddesses, the nymphs, and divine beings that fill Greek art. Here is a quote from the era describing the Tanagras, their wonderful characteristics. "The first sensation felt by the spectator of this miniature statue gallery writes one critic, is the genial and familiar character of the figures. They represent a set of everyday gestures and attitudes of the promenade or the woman's apartment, the temper and temperament of the easy Boeotian damsels of the 4th century BC. It is completely Greek, he writes, yet as different from Greek marbles as English society verses are from English epics. Another critic describing how fresh these sculptures were aesthetically, how different from what people knew about classical art, writes that they exhibit exactly that phase of classic art which was comparatively unknown to us. We've been more than 3 centuries kept in awe by the grand severity and the lofty calm of God and Goddess, but it was only when these little figures were exhumed that we became familiar with the graceful girls who undoubtedly served as models. It is not slipshod art, but what the French would call la bonne enfant, like Degas' own drawings of the ballet dancers. The author is suggesting that these are candid images of real people that offer exactly what Degas was seeking, a classical realism. And we can see here in the slouching shift of weight in the hips of the Tanagra sculpture, an echo of Degas' dancer and the movement of the weight in her own body. The Tanagra figurines were also remarked by the 19th century connoisseurs for their color because they were painted. And we can see the residue of that paint in the red hair, the ruddy locks of the Tanagra statue. They seem to be, although no one has suggested this before now, at the heart of what Degas is thinking as he makes this unexpected venture into sculpture. And it is our Cummer drawing, in part, that draws us attention to the fact that Degas in the 1870s was actively thinking about the relation of the classical and the modern, the real and the ideal, and was looking for a way to bridge the gap between them. And he found that, I think, in these images of the Tanagra figurines. As we survey Degas' statuary from the 1880s and 1890s, we see the echo in both the texture of the surfaces of his sculptures and the postures of the bodies, the poses that he chooses, in the realism and the candid expression of movement. We find the echoes of the Tanagra figurines. As you can see, the rhythms of these works, the sense of their movement in space is remarkably similar. And it's no surprise, Degas himself made images of Tanagra figurines, and as many artists did, took to heart their influence on the arts. After 1879 and the first public exhibition of Tanagra figurines, it became increasingly common to find the echo of these figures in the art of the late 19th century. So, Degas' foray into ballet, his fascination with the dancer, with the movement of the figure. He is interested in the candid pose rather than the polished performance, the image not of the ideal on stage, but of the real behind stage. We find that intellectually in the model of the Tanagra figurines. Which leads us back to our Cummer drawing. It truly is, I believe, a missing link. And another sign, I think, of what's so wonderful about not having all of our special objects in one museum. If everything were in the Louvre or the Metropolitan, so much of it would be ignored and go without attracting notice. The fact that this special image has made its way to our museum and that its twin resides in Dallas is, I think, a wonderful serendipity for us. And I think these two should be brought together. It is my hope and ambition to see an exhibition on Degas' images of ballet and his attitude to the classical past. to bring to bear Degas' training in his early inclinations on our understanding of the development of his mature phase subject, the ballet dancer, because these two are deeply intertwined in ways that we have not yet begun to appreciate, in part because of the splendid anonymity of our Cummer drawing. So thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here with us this evening. And thank you for taking time out from our hectic and busy world to join us. We're now going to take questions. And if you would please use the chat function, if you haven't already, to write your questions on the Zoom chat. And I will be happy to respond to them. I received the message, no questions yet. If anybody would like to chime in and just share a question orally, feel free to unmute yourself and have at it if there's anybody with a question out there.
Scott, it's David Courtwright.
Hi, David.
Aren't the arms of the dancer, Marie, whom you've identified as Marie in the redated 1879 sketch, shorter relative to her torso than in the other drawings and in the 1881 sculpture?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And that it bears thinking about, but my immediate response to you is that this sketch is one of those early sketches in which Degas has dispensed with the preparatory work that he used to use in his academic drawings. And it's precisely a freedom, a looseness of representation that he's after here. The other drawings of Marie van Goethem, those are simply more finished drawings. And they are because they are the models or the sketches that he used to prepare for his sculpture. Our sketch is not, obviously, it is not the model for his sculpture. I'll go back here. But these, where we have more finished images of the figures, these are images in which he is looking at the same figure in the same posture as the statue from several different angles. Because before he began to sculpt, of course, he identified a pose that he wanted and he studied it very carefully. So these are more finished drawings than our drawing, which is much more of a classic example of sketch. And I think it's precisely that lack of the grid space, the space that is controlled and that's regular and in which the figure is inscribed in a proportional manner that is characteristic of our drawing. And I don't have any problem with actually how short or stumpy the arms are. Part of it may be a question of perspective as well, because of the posture of the arms in fifth position as they're held in space, which causes some foreshortening of the arms. But a valid question, and one that I'll return to. But that's my response, is that Degas not going for proportional accuracy here. In fact, awkwardness is to a certain extent the theme of his posing ballet dancers in this image. A great question. Oh, I've got some statues, some questions now on the chat. So, do we know anything about the journey of the Cummer's Degas drawing? How did it get to Jacksonville? Well, I only know that it was collected by Ruth Phillips, who was a longtime Jacksonville native, who bequeathed it to the museum from her estate on her passing in 2005. And we can be very grateful to her for that. The story of the Dallas image is very similar, was collected by a local collector in Dallas and given to the museum there. And our museums are like that. They are, in a very special way, they are a repository, a history of the interesting people and the interesting collections from the world that have passed through our city. And the fact that we can retain some of that value and that history and that memory is an important function of a museum like the Cummer. Is the little dancer a statuette? Yes, I would call it a statuette. It is a it's approximately 3 feet tall. And in fact, some of the Tanagra figurines are that large as well. Some of the Tanagra figurines are quite small, but many of them are significantly large. And that scale that he was playing with in that image is also, I think, characteristic of the Tanagra figurines. Did Degas use grid lines in Scene with Ballerina? I'm not sure which Scene with Ballerina that would be. There's a lot of scenes of ballerinas. This, I guess, is what we're calling our picture, Scene with Ballerinas. No, there's no evidence. This is a free drawing. In fact, we can see places where he's gone back over his line and where there's as we remarked in the arms, a looseness of the rendering, which suggests a more spontaneous rendering. Have I thought about reaching out to the Dallas Museum? I have. No, I absolutely have. And I think they ought to be very interested. As far as I know, they have no idea that the Cummer drawing exists. And I don't know, I may be speaking out of turn, but I'm not sure that, that we knew at the Cummer of the Dallas work before now. At any rate, I've never heard anyone talk about them together. And neither one has ever been published before. So they are very much a pair of star-crossed lovers waiting to find their destinies together. And I think they would make an absolutely wonderful heart of an exhibition. I'm quite convinced about the date of our work in the mid 1870s or late 1870s. And in that position, this drawing means a lot more, means a very different kind of thing, very different story than it does if it's from 1890. There's nothing about this work that fits with that period, the 1890s, in Degas' career, frankly. And moreover, the presence of the classical setting in the background makes it completely unlikely to me that it would be from that later period. Because the later he goes, the more Degas moves away from any kind of scenery at all in his renderings of dancers. Are there other artists known to portray this relaxed style, or was Degas an anomaly of the time? Degas is a bit of an anomaly. He's often considered an impressionist because of his use of color, as we saw in many of the paintings that we looked at today. The looseness of color, the expressive quality of light in his mature paintings is, let's see if we can find one here, is characteristic of the Impressionist style, for sure. And he exhibited with the Impressionists and was friends with the Impressionists. But he did not consider himself an Impressionist. In fact, Degas considered himself a realist. And we might look to other realists of the realist movement in 19th century France, to Courbet, for instance, for figures, painters who are interested in those awkwardly candid representations of the real. You know, in our lives, as we Instagram and take pictures of ourselves while holding phones over our heads, we're always interested in capturing what we imagine to be an ideal or a perfected view of ourselves. And that's frequently the function of a photographer or a portrait maker, is to make us look a little more perfect. And that's also the function of the stage in dance, in ballet. When you go up on the stage, the audience has a very controlled view. You can only see from one direction. You don't get to look from up top or down bottom or from the wings or from the background. You see dance in a very different way then, a controlled way in which, like the people down at the bottom of Plato's cave, we can only see what we're allowed to see. We have blinders on. Degas wanted to take those blinders off, in part to undo the illusion of perfection that we see in the classical dance or that we see in classical art. And there were other realists, of course, who did the same thing. And Courbet is a perfect example of that. The awkwardness of his compositions and the awkwardness of his figures betray that image that we sometimes find of ourselves when someone takes a snapshot of you and you're in motion and your face is caught in a strange, fleeting, momentary, awkward gesture. Degas was interested in the candid characteristics of the body in space. Where are the Tanagra figurines today? So they're all over the place. There are a lot of them, and a lot of them are fakes, unfortunately. I don't think that matters to us. In the 1880s and 1890s, the fakes and the authentic ones circulated freely, and everybody considered them all to be one and the same. There wasn't enough knowledge at the time to understand that there were fakes circulating. Degas may very well have been influenced by quite a few fakes that he regarded as authentic Tanagras. The Tanagras, though, first came to France and Paris, the very first collectors, and some of the largest collections are in the Louvre. But very rapidly, the other European nations and America got in on the game. And there was a collecting fervor. In fact, I might go so far as to call it a cultural sensation, a fever in the 1890s and 1880s. And part of it was that these objects were small, they were portable, they were relatively cheap. Just about anybody with enough money to own one could own one. Nobody can go buy the Elgin marbles today, right? You can't own the Parthenon. But if you wanted a piece of ancient Greek history that felt really authentic and really intimate, and that showed what seemed to be real Greek people, not goddesses and nymphs, then this was your thing. And so they became incredibly popular. For a period of about 25 or 30 years, the Tanagra was absolutely a sensation. And Degas did actually, of course, make references to them. First of all, he made drawings of that early statuette that we showed, which is not technically a Tanagra because it doesn't come from the city of Tanagra. But the word Tanagra is just a place name. It's like calling all sodas a Coke, right? It became a brand name for the Tanagras. And he himself included Tanagras in later compositions. In the 1880s, he did several portraits of his friends, the Rouards, and he included Tanagra figurines, and in fact did a portrait of the young Rouard daughter, Helene Rouard, as dressed up as a Tanagra and posing as a Tanagra. So he was very consciously aware of and working with the Tanagras at this moment in time. And please show us the Cummer picture next to the Dallas picture. I can't do a side-by-side, I'm sorry, I didn't prepare one, but I'll show you one and the other and we'll go back and forth. So you can see, here's our picture. And here's the Dallas picture. It's a very unusual image. It suggests that Degas maybe had larger ambitions for this composition. Usually if an artist makes a colored version of a sketch, it seems like he's leading towards a painting. And I wonder if he planned a painting or if this was itself the next phase, the last phase that he imagined for the composition. But it was clearly a composition that he was thinking about. This wasn't a one-off, in other words. It's more evidence that the ideas in it, the presence of the Parthenon, the Acropolis, the dancers in the foreground, was an important theme for Degas that he was working on. So what's interesting about it, it's the only work that I know of, I think that anybody knows of, in which he's doing pastel on board. And you can actually see the texture of the wood, the board itself coming through. That's the underlayment color also. The ground is not prepared with any gouache or any gesso or anything. So it is, it's an image in which there's something of the grid coming through just because we have so much of that horizontal grain in the wood. And that horizontal grain gives a kind of structure. It implies a spatial structure that for me at least recalls in a way the grid that in which Degas drew earlier in his career. And that also recalls, I think, the texture in this image of the floorboards and the vertical panes. That is, Degas is painting the dancer against a ground which is marked by the memory of these lines, these ordering lines of the classical space. How did he get so much access backstage? Well, men of privilege and wealth had no problem getting access backstage. In fact, the darker side of the ballet studios in this era was that the boulevardier and the men of a certain means came and went very freely in those studios, where they found young lovers and girls who, because of their backgrounds, were vulnerable to those predations. As far as we know, in fact, Degas did not take advantage of the girls who posed for him. But that is certainly partly how he gained so much access backstage. And how many sculptures did Degas complete? Oh, quite a few. In addition to dancers, he did horses and various other subjects. And there are, I believe, a couple of dozen sculptures. He sculpted always in wax. So all of the works that he produced, the sculptures that he produced, were in wax. And they were all in the same way, pigmented, polychromed, painted. Again, we don't see that today because the wax has darkened so much, but they've done chemical analysis of the beeswax and shown that the pigment is not just painted on top. Degas actually made waxes that were pigmented so that the color is in the wax itself, a very clear sign that color was an important part of his concept of these pieces. They're all wax, and when he died in 1919, after not having exhibited any sculptures since 1881, since the very first sculpture, he was, as Renoir said, the greatest living sculptor, Renoir claimed. And his heirs, Degas' heirs, took these wax models and they cast them in bronze and issued editions, which is why there are so many versions of The Little Dancer and so many of these other works spread around through museums around the world. Degas' heirs controlled access to the editions, but they produced, in many cases, dozens of copies of each one. And so there are now hundreds of Degas sculptures around the world, but the bronze editions are different from the wax ones. I mean, they just are inevitably. They're never always exactly the same. In fact, each bronze casting is always subtly different from the last one. And so the wax originals, which I showed you today primarily, are the ones that for our purposes, my purposes, that I'm really interested in here. Degas traveled to places like Greece and Italy. He did, of course, to Italy. As far as I know, never to Greece. In fact, very few people did travel to Greece in those days. It was more an imagination of Greece. Although increasingly archaeology and scholarship made the Greek antiquities available to people like Degas. And there you could go and see casts and copies of the Parthenon sculptures in many places in the 19th century, to which Degas had ready access. And so he drew from those casts and models, as we can see when he's making drawings of the Apoxamenos and the Borghese gladiator, that learning to draw from antiquities was the basis of a classical training in art for Degas and all artists of this era. And so he certainly was deeply familiar with the Parthenon sculptures and the classical masterpieces, which defined what the 19th century thought of as good taste and beautiful form. And differences between the Cummer sketch and the Dallas one. There are subtle differences. I mean, they're quite subtle. There are some subtle differences in the lining of the faces in the Dallas image. In fact, I would say that the women, the faces of the dancers in the Dallas image are a little even more plainer and plain featured and than the dancers in our image. And that may be partly because we have more of a contrast from color, or it may be in part due to the character of the ground, the medium on which Degas is representing, making pastel image here. But the differences are really, I think, profoundly subtle and primarily have to do with the differences of medium, of color pastel versus charcoal, pastel on board versus charcoal on paper. And we do have, because of the use of color, an atmosphere, which we don't in Degas' sketch. And finally, are there any images that recreate any sense of what the original wax colors might have looked like? Well, yes and no. In particular with the little dancer aged 14, because Degas dressed her up, the editions of this always include the same elements. So she always has a skirt and a bodice that's always painted in a kind of golden color. And there is also paint and color on her skin in many of the bronze editions. But again, it's difficult even to know exactly what those wax sculptures looked like. They were already apparently very dark in 1919 when the family, the heirs of Degas, began to cast them. And so those castings, which are all pretty much done in the mid-20th century, certainly don't have any scientific relationship to the coloration or the execution of the originals. We have to do a little bit of a mind's eye imagination of what they must have looked like. But that colored painted sculpture, that was certainly one of the things that set the critics on edge in 1881, who just said, what is Degas doing here? This is insane. This painter is now making sculptures of the most hideous little cretins, the street urchins, and painting them and dressing them up in tutus. They thought it was bizarre. On the other hand, at the very same time, these were the critics who were marveling over those Tanagra sculptures and their paintings and their candid views of ancient women. So I want to thank you, by way of conclusion, all for joining us. Thank you for your rich questions, and I hope that the last hour has given you a little space from the energy and the excitement of current events, and a space for reflection, and to think about the past, and to think about our own community and the richness and beauty and memory which it is ours to treasure and to take care of here in Jacksonville. So thank you all so much for joining us. I look forward to our last of these 3 lectures. After the holidays, we will reconvene in January for a talk on the Cummer's wonderful collection of lamentations and pietas. So thank you all, and I bid you good night.